Hello, everyone. We are just waiting for folks to get into the room and we'll get started. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Allison Hurrier and I head up the Textile Arts curriculum at Portland State University. For those of you joining us from outside the university, the Textile Arts curriculum is an elective track in the BFA Art Practice program that provides an interdisciplinary approach to the study of clothing and textiles. We offer courses in weaving, surface design, sewn construction, and dress history that encourage students to develop portfolios for a variety of applications in fashion, costume, textiles, and contemporary art. This is one of several events that we're hosting this term where we invite students and the public together to engage with outside perspectives that supplement our current course offerings. And this evening we are joining Shelley's digital weaving class. Please feel free to just visit our website if you want to find out about upcoming programming. And we'll put that in the chat here in a second. Before I turn things over to Thuong and Shelley, I would like to acknowledge that we are joining you from Portland State University, which is located in the heart of downtown Portland, Oregon in Multnomah County. We honor the indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand on, the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of Chinook, the Tualatin Kayapuya, and the other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and to recognize that we are here because of the sacrifices forced upon them. In remembering these communities, we honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. Thuong, thank you so much for being here with us this evening. And Shelley, thank you so much for opening up your classroom with us. I will let you both take it from here.
That's great. Greetings, everyone. And just one correction. The class is an analog this term, analog weaving.
I'm so sorry.
very different experience, but totally connected. So I'm super excited to hear our guest tonight speak about both things in addition to some other things. So Thuong, I'm going to read your bio right now, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to you. All right. Wonderful. Thương Hoài Trần is a Vietnamese immigrant whose background informs and influences their interdisciplinary art practice. They hold a BFA degree in painting and printmaking from Emporia State University and an MFA degree in print media from the School of Art Institute of Chicago. Most of their artwork features a level of distortion or fragmentation. These visual gaps allude to the physical and metaphorical distances and turmoil experienced by diasporic communities. In their recent works, they are examining the process of weaving, disassembling clothes made in Vietnam, and recreating family photographs to learn more about their origins. This process becomes an approach to connecting to their heritage, paying homage, and filling in the gaps created through various barriers such as language, displacement, generational disconnect, and cultural complexities. Zhang's work has been exhibited in the Research House for Asian Art, Janet Turner Print Museum, Artist Image Resource, and Megalo Print Studio, to name a few. Most recently, they were selected as a 2022 finalist for the AXA Art Prize and a recipient of a full fellowship to a residency with the studios at Mass MoCA. And with that, I would like to turn the floor over to our guest, Thuong. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Shelley and Allison, for that introduction. I will begin sharing my screen now. Thank you so much to everyone who's also present today and attending tonight. I'm honored to have this opportunity to talk about my artwork. So please don't hesitate to reach out or contact me after this discussion with any comments or even any questions that you aren't comfortable talking here. Tonight, I will be walking us through my presentation, which consists of my past, my journey in education, my process, where I am currently, and possibly where I'm heading next. So to start this all off, my name is Thương Hoài Trần, and throughout this presentation, I'll also highlight all of the ways that I was experimenting through my education journey and how I have decided on certain decisions and what ended up working for certain projects. I want to start off this artist talk by sharing a little bit about my past, my family, and my biography. So much of my work is influenced by all of these components and my personal narrative, so it only feels fitting that we start here. I was born in Tây Ninh, Vietnam. My family and I immigrated to the United States when I was about 6 years old in 2004, uprooting everything that I've ever known in Vietnam to come to the United States without knowing anything else except for 2 words, hi and bye in English. We moved across the earth and landed pretty much directly in the middle of the United States, directly in Kansas, specifically in a small town by the name of Emporia, Kansas, located in between 2 larger cities, about an hour and a half away, both from Wichita and Kansas City. So as you can just imagine, the act of immigrating created a multitude of disruptions in my life at an early age. This ultimately skewed my own perception of my own identity growing up and the possible inner turmoil that's created through not only moving to a new country, but also an environment and demographic of people in Kansas having an effect on how I grew up. I was immediately being integrated into an American life and a school system. I was learning English as my ability to speak Vietnamese slowly declined, learning the American history as my own familial and cultural history gets buried, constantly searching for myself and my own spaces of belonging. And I then was seeking out art as an outlet. Art became kind of an escape for me in rediscovering myself, in excavating familial history, and also ultimately healing for myself. And maybe it was even a natural thing that I gravitated towards the creative field. I've always noticed other members of my family always being in some sort of creative field or being very well crafted in what they were doing, whether this was a means of making money for survival or if it was for fun, or they were just really well crafted in the skills that they had. When I was living in Vietnam with my family, we used to own a jewelry store. Here on the left is a picture of my uncle and my father making jewelry themselves so that we would then sell at our jewelry store. On the top right is my grandmother, who's sitting at her sewing machine, and she's often fixing or altering clothes for other people, whether it is for our family or in town. On the bottom right is my grandfather, who was always seen carrying his films and his cameras around everywhere he went. And while this was a means for him to capture life in the United States so he can send abroad for his family to witness his life living in the United States, he did it in such a beautiful and poetic way. So for me, I view being an artist as a really great privilege that I'm really grateful to have. And I've witnessed a lot of families and other immigrant families struggle, including myself, to maintain heritage, culture, and tradition while trying to survive in this unfamiliar land. And I've always appreciated the creative processes in my own family. While leaving Vietnam was viewed as a chance to create new life, it was also a chance for my family and I to reunite with our grandfather, my grandfather on my father's side, who came to the United States after fighting in the war. He specifically was a person whom I use as a subject for the majority of my work. Thao Minh Trăng was someone who I really only had a brief relationship with. After a few years moving to the United States, he passed away. And so for me, a lot of my work is about in dedication to him, because he was the starting point for how my family members and I are even here at the moment. So when I'm using his image, it's a particular pain of homage. And before I even get into a lot of the direct images that I will be showing of my work, I want to give a brief overview of some of the techniques and the themes that I'm exploring in my work. These are things that I'm continually thinking about even when I'm going into a new body of work. I often use distortion, manipulation of imageries in order to talk about the complexities of being an immigrant, but also how much of the work is centered around time, which talks about labor and also connecting to my family members. As you can imagine, the amount of time that you're spent on the loom is hours upon hours, and the hours that you're spending also on the press. It's both labor intensive, but also an act of love. And so for me, this creates a space to contemplate and spend time with our images, as I'm often referencing family photographs. And so I will start my journey in the art world by talking about where I was starting in undergrad. I grew up in the small town of Emporia, so I naturally went to my local university, and I actually had a really hard time committing to pursuing art as a possible career. For me, it felt like a little bit more of a risky decision to pursue art as a career, just given the amount of sacrifices my family had made, and knowing that I had a really hard time struggling internally. But I also realized that if I didn't see myself pursuing something that I felt so passionately about, I would really regret it down the line. So for me, I have come to realize now that there are so many opportunities for me to share my own personal narratives, like what I'm doing here right now, and showing my own personal archives of familial history, and ultimately finding ways to interpret myself through my art. I often think about how little representation I see of my own ethnicity in the Western world of fine arts. And by sharing my own personal narratives, I want to be that point in relation for other people to feel that sense of familiarity when they're looking at art. So I started off as a painting major. Painting and drawing was something that I was always drawn to. So for me, I thought that this was an obvious choice until I really kind of fell in love with printmaking when I started to get further down in my degree. There were just so many processes in the printmaking process that it really started to get me involved. And also that labor-intensive act of care, going into every single piece and also being able to make duplicates and multiples, having 35 prints of the same exact matrix. And so for me, I've always been drawn to portraiture as a way to tell stories, and this is an ever-present component in my body of work. And so throughout my years of undergrad, by the last year, I was working towards the solo show of displaying a mix of paintings, prints, and sculptures that I was working on. And I decided to center it around a project that I had collaborated with other Asian Americans living in Kansas. I had spoken to each and every one of them to investigate their familial history and also to talk about their current self. I started these conversations to really learn about their lives. And here in each painting depicts each person at the current state of their life to celebrate their life, while also revisiting their childhood in every single print. In this set, I have here my own family on the left, and then a portrait of myself here on the right. And Nestine was actually someone who had participated in my project after I reached out to her. And we had a lot of personal in-depth conversation about our own individual experiences. And this project in particular kind of helped me to understand all of the differences, but yet similarities that we shared while living in the state of Kansas at the time. And while I was working on my body of work for the BFA show, I was also thinking about what did I want to do after undergrad. So I started to think about attending an MFA. And for me, I started to think about going to the National Portfolio Day in order to really talk to each and every school that I was interested in. And so I sent out 10 different applications to a number of schools, and ultimately I came down to these 3. It was a really tough choice for me, and I had asked a lot of friends, a lot of professors, and my own family for advice, but at the end of the day, I kind of knew what I was gravitating towards, and each school here kind of offered me something a little bit different, and I ultimately ended up picking the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for its wide interdisciplinary approach and amount of resources. So now I'll get into my grad experience at SAIC. This slide here kind of highlights some of the works that I've made throughout graduate school. And these 2 pictures in particular show my studio during my first year and my second year, where my studio was fully covered all across the wall. And I really have to think that coming to grad school kind of changed the trajectory of my work and my entire body of work, because coming to this school, I kind of knew that I wanted to make use of some of the facilities that I didn't have access to in undergrad and learn some techniques that I've never learned before. And this is where I was introduced to the world of fibers. So how did I kind of dive into all of this? It honestly started with a series of prints. So I started going through the series of photographs depicting my parents' wedding. I happened to stumble across this photograph of my uncle videographing what was happening that day. I didn't know it at the time, but this started a much larger series of artwork called Gini, which is taken directly on the back of these photographs. For these prints, I had to go through a process of digitally taking them apart and analyzing every single layer. I did this in order to create a Trompe-l'oeil effect and intentionally printing in the medium of lithography in order to create that laborious demands in printing more traditionally, and to replicate something that looks just like a photograph in order to trick you into thinking that you're looking at the real thing. And to simulate this experience, I have here also the actual print present on the left side and the actual scanned photograph on the right side. And I was really trying to replicate my family members' handwriting through the act of tracing. This act of repetition through copying out someone else's handwriting, the act of trying to swoop my letters a certain way became almost an act of devotion as I scrapped away many, many drafts. And as someone who's almost illiterate in the language, it also became apparent that there was another barrier through trying to dissect my family's history and heritage. And now there's an ever-present barrier of language right in between us. This barrier also became another layer of removal for where I'm trying to understand and where I'm trying to examine this history. And this also became a starting point for another series of my work, which is titled Made in Vietnam. This series started as I moved to Chicago and was attending the school for the first time. This change of environment itself was the first time in my life where I was really separated from my family. And as I was exploring the city, I was really drawn to these thrift stores. I really didn't have an idea at the time, but I was roaming through the aisles and I kept seeing these tags that said Made in Vietnam. So I began sourcing these articles of clothing without an actual plan of action. But in a way, I was searching for myself and my pieces of myself throughout these aisles and aisles of clothing. I started to give various treatments and experimenting, almost as a form of investigating these articles of clothing. The first one was to suspend the folds of clothing by encasing them in plaster. While they look very strong, they're incredibly fragile, as there's only a thin layer of plaster applied onto the clothing. So any sort of pressure that you give into the plaster, it will begin to crack away. And some shirts I just left alone because it seemed to speak for itself. There was such an irony in the fact that there was this American flag, which is a symbol to be seen so sacred as to not be broken or to be altered. Yet here on the shirt, it is jagged in all sorts of places and disassembled in a way, and possibly sold during 4th of July by Old Navy. And yet when we come up closer and we inspect this act of patriotism, you see that it's made in Vietnam. By analyzing these shirts, it also led me into focusing on the tags themselves. I view this as an act or an attempt of preservation by encasing them in these acrylic containers. It tried to highlight and showcase these tags in a way to bring them more attention. Typically, we don't have any indicators to the person who's making these articles of clothing, and the tiny, tiny evidence to the possible location is traced through this tag. I was heavily thinking about the unseen labor in a lot of these clothings. And through working with just these tags, I thought about what is a possible way to highlight them even more, drawing more attention to them. We typically don't pay attention to them until they start to bother us. We often cut them away with scissors, we rip them off of our clothing, and instead, I chose to carefully unravel the stitches one by one in order to preserve as much of the tag as possible. I was also thinking about these treatments almost scientifically, if you can say that. I was constantly thinking about the ways that butterflies are often pinned onto foam and displaying with their wings out, and text written on the bottom of them for viewers to learn about each specimen or species of butterfly. And as you can see, there are now some correlation and similarities between the work. I was using these very tiny dressmaker pins to simulate that similar look of pinning the butterflies or pinning the actual notation of what the butterflies are. And I started to introduce the method of painting back into the series by preparing all of my canvases in this bright red ground, which is how I often prepared my paintings for portraits. And here's a close-up detail of the tag. I thought this tag in particular was quite ironic as well, as it's directly asking us questions of who, what, and where, but playing on the word where as if you would wear the shirt or where it's located at. And this brand is often found at Target. In this particular photograph, I had a painting that was completed in 2018 titled, "What Are We?" And placing it next to this new piece at the time, I started to notice they were asking a very similar questions, just in very different presentations. These tags felt like a new way of disassembling the paintings themselves, possibly a way to deconstruct the painting without a formal figure. And my last treatment on these shirts were to fully disassemble the shirts in order to really learn about the process of someone who had put these shirts together with all of its parts. For me, I thought that this was going to be a really simple task, maybe something that would take 30 minutes tops. But as you can see, the total time of this disassembling took 3 hours and 34 minutes total, because I was trying to be so careful and not to break any threads. Did I break threads in the process? Yes, but I didn't try to sweat it because I knew there was so much more to unravel, and I was treating it with the utmost respect as I was trying to really consider who was making it before me. And so every seam was taken apart and every thread was trying to keep as intact as possible, including every elastic. And so I ended up with three shirts completely disassembled. And this process took over 24 hours. During this process, I would start to see the residual effects of pulling these threads apart hours upon hours, day after day. These physical traces became present on my fingers, and this left me with questions. I'm doing this barely for an art project, and yet now it's making me question, what type of conditions were forced upon the actual people who have made these clothings. So it led me to do a lot of research on these conditions and everything that they were forced upon. And so for me, it was important to also record this process of disassembling each and every shirt. And it ended up being a 1-minute time lapse of all of these shirts being disassembled all at the same time. Here is more of an installation view where I, for myself as well, was finally able to see the work all in its totality together. And this piece, although it started from a personal point of finding myself and trying to find myself in this unfamiliar place, it became so much more than that. I began to think about the impact of fast fashion. I began to think about the unseen labor, the article of clothing that is made in Vietnam, but then shipped to the United States to be worn for maybe a season or 2 or 3. And then it ends up one step away from being discarded at a thrift store. And so after this project, I was urged by a number of faculty to take fibers courses. Without any prior experience or understanding in fibers, I was incredibly hesitant, but I'm glad that I started to do it anyways. I branched out of my comfort zone and started weaving, and this entirely changed my practice. I started taking classes with John Paul Morabito, who was teaching many of the digital and floral loom weaving courses throughout their time at SAIC. While I was incredibly intimidated by the medium, their course really welcomed me and pushed me into thinking about fibers and weaving in a completely different way. I started my weaving journey through the digital jacquard weaving course, and we were learning on how to use the TC2 looms. This was my very first time weaving on the loom of any sort. So as you can see here, I've actually swapped all of the dark and light tones in terms of the patterning when I had applied it onto the digital file. So you can see it's actually an inverse of what I was showing in the previous slide. For me, this was kind of a scary process, diving completely into this new medium that I had no idea what it was, and also kind of tackling a machine that was incredibly expensive. But I was really drawn to the process and the act of weaving itself. It felt like a similar dance to when you are printing and you're getting into the rhythm of editioning. So for me, I was starting to revisit all of these wedding photographs of my parents' wedding from the earlier series in the prints, and I started to really try and develop on this series. I was taking this course and unsure of the direction, so I was unsure about all of the colors, but then I got a lot of suggestions from my faculty who had suggested to use color more intentionally. And so I started to source a bunch of yarn on my own and thinking about how do I then take directly from these images and source all of these color palettes in terms of these golds, red, and silver, and also using these colors more intentionally as also a signifier. When people are looking at these works, they know immediately of its possible location. And for me, I had done a lot of experimenting on how to even utilize these materials. Some of these weavings presented, these two here specifically, I view them more as sketches to a finalized product or a finalized piece. And I was trying to think about what's a fine line between distorting in real time on the loom versus distorting in my digital file. So there was a lot of things for me to think about when I was weaving. At this time, I was experimenting. How do I even create these glitches and these distortions when I'm weaving? So I would directly go in to pull the yarn out of my weft and to disrupt the image in itself. You're now seeing a string of yarn across someone's face or text. And then I would be on the loom also and weave. Stop to record what number I was at, and then insert a completely random number of weft count and weave again. Then go back to my original number, which then created all of these gaps in the weaving itself. And to create these distortions, I then stumbled upon a result of this series, or this weaving in particular. And it resorted in the skewed, distorted image of my family. And it represents to me an unraveling of these memories, a simulation of these memories and images, the overwhelming feeling of grasping something to interpret without having all of the tools. And as for the silver and gold piece in the back, I was working with this color palette and to create a visual distortion of color. This piece encourages people to view this piece at various points and various perspectives. At certain angles, you really wouldn't be able to see these figures themselves. You'd get a glimpse of maybe their body, a glimpse of their facial features, but as you move across the room, you get a better look at everything in its totality. And while in this piece, I was pushing to see how far I can take pulling these threads through the actual weaving itself. And from afar, this piece almost looks abstract. With the amount of detail, it can almost overwhelm you. And you can see all of the strings cascading down the entire piece. I've had different interpretations of this piece in particular. Are the strings a way of protecting the people who are present in the piece? Is it a way of protecting the text so that viewers can't read it? And then up close, that's when you start to really realize that there are figures all along this weaving and actual texts that are present. And on the very last piece that I made in this digital weaving class, I made this piece and I was actually heavily encouraged to think about scale. This piece at the time was one of the larger pieces that I wove in that class, so I couldn't really wrap my head around creating something even bigger than that. But we'll get to that later on in this presentation. But first, I have to talk about my experiences with the floor loom, because that will all come together here. I have really begun to fall in love with the process of weaving, and I had a lot of concerns. How do I access jacquard in the future when I want to weave and I don't have the materials or the resources to access a jacquard? Then I started thinking about learning the process of floor loom and dyeing my own yarn. And so I took a 3-week-long summer intensive course. 3 week is not very long at all for a class. And so it was very intense. And so we had to do all of this within 3 weeks. And all of the techniques that were mediated by the TC2, when I had first learned about weaving, I was now being placed upon when learning about floor loom. It was like learning a completely new language, so different from anything that I've done in the digital weaving course, and so different from anything that I've ever learned before. Oftentimes, weavers are equating to a set of codes and binaries, and so this was completely different. Towards the end of our 3-week course, we were asked to work on gathering some techniques and experiences that we had learned throughout the class and work on a piece for the final. I had proposed a project where I wanted to try painting a warp. And for this entire process, it involves a lot of preparation before it can even go on the loom. The process took multiple days in where I was organizing the yarn, I was preparing it to dye, then dyeing it gradually from the lightest color to the darkest colors, wrapping the entire table with plastic wrap, including my own work, so that it can sit for over 24 hours without drying out, and then rinsing it all out. This resulted in this piece named after, oh, I'm sorry, the lights just turned off. It resulted in this piece titled Taomenzheng, which is a portrait of my grandfather. And here is some detail shots. I was still using a lot of the techniques that I had learned in the digital weaving course by incorporating a lot of the metallic yarn throughout the entire weaving, and also using techniques of pulling the yarn out of the image itself to further distort the image. And now I was met with this task of how do I finish this piece? I wanted an object or some type of thing to weigh down each and every one of these strands. And this is where all of the feng shui coins kind of come into this piece. I was thinking about the act of joss paper burning and the rituals and ceremonies that go into celebrating those that have passed. So every year, my family and I would also make food, burn joss paper, or burn incense to pay respects to our past loved ones. And for me, the act of tying these coins was in conversation with these rituals. And these coins are actually simulating a real Ming Dynasty coin that I sourced on eBay. I really wanted to use these coins. However, being able to source over hundreds of these wasn't readily available for me. So that's where the feng shui coins really came in to simulate the real coin. This piece in particular belonged to a larger series of weavings depicting images of my grandparents. The set on the right are from my paternal side, and the set on the left depicts my paternal side, and then the set on the left, oh, I'm sorry, the set on the right is my maternal side, and the set on the left is my paternal side. And with each and every piece, there were varying amounts of distortion, which represented about how much I knew or how little I knew of them. And so this kind of moves me into one of my last piece, which is talking about this family photograph of a temple. As I had mentioned, we were going to be revisiting this piece called Gaodai Temple. And I felt like after acquiring all of the experience and knowledge through not only a digital course, but a more analog process in doing floor loom weaving, I was more confident in to actually overtake this really large scale piece. And so I started to think about scale. It started with these 3 images that depict this massive temple located in Dainan. It's located in a place that I was born in, yet I've never actually visited this temple myself. The task was so daunting that I started with creating this mock-up on how I could envision this piece to be displayed in the future. This helped me to plan my digital file, and I made further decisions to make these strips smaller, to reference the original photograph of my mother standing by the entryway as she's met with these strips of imagery and placing her hand to walk through the actual curtain itself. So I started weaving, and more weavings, session after session. Nights turned into many days where I would break dawn, weaving from night until I would start work at 10 in the morning. Slowly but surely, there were things that were starting to come together, and this was my first time I had ever gotten the cutoffs for my first section in this body of work. It was really exciting to see this level of scale that exceeded my own body, and also I had planned this piece to be at a maximum of 9 feet. But of course, everything doesn't always go as planned, and it ended up being well over 10 feet. And this was the first time that I had ever set it up vertically in my studio to really notice its scale. And this is almost the full length of my studio walls. Eventually, I started to gather up more and more pieces until I had the final amount to work with. I was attempting to weave this series initially to do it all in one go, but the task was so monumental, I had to break it up into 2 sessions. At first, the seam between these 2 parts seemed like a conundrum. How do I make these seams disappear? It can't be hidden because people would have to walk through it and experience it from the front and also the back side of the piece. So then I began to think, how do I make it as a highlighting point, a possible point of tension, a point of meaning? So I thought back to these coins that were incorporated into the weaving of my grandfather. These coins produce a really beautiful sound as you were to interact with them. So this piece in particular had used all of the techniques that I had learned up until this point. It was all of the techniques from disassembling the clothing, where I had used the tweezers to do really fine detailing with thread work, but then also using all of the techniques that I had learned from all of the past courses that I had taken. And so utilizing all of this, I was tying these coins in order to join the 2 parts together. At this point, I was preparing all of this work to be ready for a show, and I was pretty much living in my studio at the time. I was ironing, I was steaming, I was cutting the edges of these weavings. I went through a lot of yarn, a lot of fray check liquid in order to seal the edges of these weavings before I could take it onto the sewing machine. At first, I thought about hemming these pieces, but I ended up undoing it and creating a zigzag stitch across the entire edges to help it from fraying any further. Knowing that I was going to also suspend each one of these pieces, I had prepared wooden dowels and sprayed them with metallic gold in order to finish off each and every one of these detailings. This was the final outcome of this piece, and I decided to go with a staggering layout of this piece in order to create further distortion of this image, to then also create a space in the middle where you can stand directly inside and experience yourself being inside, encapsulated into this weaving. I also wanted to steer away from an appearance of a flat wall while it's suspended, as the gaps would possibly invite viewers to see themselves within this piece and to go in between it. The gaps left are so that you can invite yourself into the piece. And as you walk through this, you're also greeted with the sounds of the coins that are jingling softly. And here's a snippet of what that possibly would have sounded like. This piece for me is to talk about creating a physical space, one for which I have never been to, a simulation of a location, a simulation of a memory, a recreation of a family photograph. And here in this photo, you can also see peering into the next room is where I use an image of my mother peering from these strips of imagery by the doorway. It's mirroring the possible action of the people and the viewers who have to experience a similar action in order to actually enter into the temple. in its latest installation, I was able to see this piece installed in a completely different way. Installed on the wall, this piece becomes so much more pictorial. I am really excited about all of the possibilities and the different ways that this piece could be shown in the future. And so this kind of leads me into where am I at now after grad school? Currently, I'm working as a gallery technician for the school. And so these are some few images that I'm sharing in the process of preparing our spaces. This job kind of started as a position in grad school. And towards the end of my degree, I was applying to a permanent staff gallery technician position. In a lot of ways, I think about this job as a way to also inform my ways of making. It helps me to prepare all of my work and think about the ways that I can handle the work and how to display the work while they are finished. And lately, I've been doing some research about a possible upcoming series, and where I'm really interested in the histories of nail salons and their ties to Vietnamese women. And on the side, I'm also doing a lot of research on possibly looking into more specific topics about the Vietnamese diaspora. I feel like there's a lot of general research about diaspora, but not many articles specifically about the Vietnamese diaspora. And also my up next coming opportunity is to focus on more projects at the studios at Mass Mocha. I am currently in the process of trying to reserve a loom while I'm there in the middle of July and to the end of, or in the end of January, middle of January to the end of January. So there I will still be focusing on my practice in fibers, and that's pretty much concluding the presentation for today. Thank you so much to everyone who's here and sticking around to hear about my process and my journey in the art world.
Yes, so if any of, first of all, that was amazing. I am super excited. And I know that my students are going to be really excited to know how you did that dyeing on the warp before you put it on your loom. They're probably like, wait a minute, can we please do that? Yeah, I know, amazing. So please, anyone chime in. There's lots of stuff coming into the chat now. So how should we work that? Yeah, it's really great. Maybe I can start by asking you, could you explain that process a little bit about how you dyed and how did you thicken your dyes? I know that will be something my students would like to know in order to paint on that warp.
Yeah, I actually didn't alter any of the dye at all, except for maybe diluting it with water. I viewed it almost as if I was watercoloring, but just on a bunch of threads. I started that process by organizing all of the yarn into every individual inch that I would predict to be on the loom itself. And I've seen a lot of people after I did this process also put their warp directly into a reed while they have it on the table. And so then I started to lay a template, a large printout of whatever I was going to be painting on underneath after I've organized all of the yarn. And then I just started to go in with all of the paint colors that or dye color that I wanted to dye the warp itself. I started really slowly. I tried to not use a ton of dye because I know it will really bleed if I use too much water. But I was using a foam brush, which I think also helped to stamp into the fibers of the thread really well. And before I had done all of that, I also did a soda ash wash on top of the entire piece. Yeah.
Yeah, so my students have done some natural dyeing, and so they don't know what soda ash is, but that would be like the mordant, an equivalent of a mordant. And then after you wove, I'm still trying to get my head around that. That's just incredible. How did you keep the warp from not shifting? It turned out beautifully where you still can recognize the images. Amazing.
Thank you so much. Yeah, sometimes it was really hard to tell because it was so distorted. But I tried to give myself little indicators also. I was trying to tie all of the warps back in almost like a Roy G. Biv, so that I know, okay, the red goes first into the loom itself, and then next is orange, next is yellow. And so I try to give myself indicators, and throughout the process, I also thought about, okay, how do I keep this from flipping entirely? And so then I'd have one that's facing right, one that's facing incorrectly. In the future, I would mark with maybe Sharpie on the top face of each and every one of those warp bundles to really indicate this is what needs to go on top. And I tried to just pull it as tight as possible when I was dyeing, and then pulling it as tight as possible when I was trying to warp it on the beam.
So students, you feel free to chime in here, because I know that you're in the middle of understanding what analog weaving is a little bit. Was that a 4 or 8 shaft pattern, or, oh, are you getting up to get, oh, your light keeps going up.
Was that sorry?
That's okay. Was that a 4 shaft or an 8 shaft pattern that you were weaving there?
I believe it was a 16 harness loom, a make lumber. Yeah, I had the opportunity to jump directly into a really big loom after doing a bunch of smaller samples to learn about different patterning.
Yes, so we're just in the process of working on a 4 and 8 shaft, and most students, actually, we have one student who's taken the digital weaving. I'm hoping that you are all inspired to take digital weaving in spring, because yeah, you can do it's quite different, but it's also very related, right? Wouldn't you say? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I felt like my experience in taking both sides of weaving was really rounded out after I was able to experience the analog weaving, but then also the digital weaving. There's so much of possibility in the digital weaving that you can't do on the floor loom, but then learning floor loom really helps to further understand what it means to weave digitally.
Yes. Yes, Isaac, you will want to take digital weaving, I promise. You will totally love it.
I think we've got one. Is it Pa has a question? Has their hand raised? Hey. Oh, Pav, sorry. I'm so sorry.
It's going to sound like I'm rambling for a while, so just bear with me. So distortion's always been a part of your process, what you're interested in. It's always been 2D, and it wasn't until the last one where it was 3D and interactive. And I wanted to like to know, when did you come up with the idea that you wanted to make it 3-dimensional?
Yeah, I think something about also getting away from the family photographs that depicted faces and trying to replicate a building made me want to gravitate towards something more dimensional and something where people can actually enter into the building and simulate that experience, because I wanted to simulate what it was like to go into that temple that I've never been in as well, even though I was born there. So, not in the temple, but the city.
So when you made it interactive, when the people moved around it, did it actually move the weavings around?
Yes, yes. It was actually, sometimes it would be a bunch of different panels kind of flying back and forth. Sure. And so it was really interesting to see how people, either they were really careful or they just went full force and go directly into the piece. Some people were so careful that they like tried to position their body directly in between the gaps, which I thought, it's okay, you can touch the piece.
Well, I think it'd be interesting because the humans are actually weaving through your weaving, right? And then when you found out that your coins were making noise, was that like implied, or was that like just a happy accident that it was also making sound?
Yeah, I think it was also kind of like a happy accident by putting all of these coins together, and part of interaction and moving the weaving, it started to create a bunch of sound, and I felt like that was a really great component of the work.
I think adding that human, sure. I think adding that human element to it, where it's different every time for every person, and it's different every time based on how many people are interacting with it. And I mean, you got so many different things going on. It's really amazing.
Thank you so much, Pat.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Also, one more question. So back to when you were taking off the labels and you're putting them in acrylic boxes with pins, how did you link that to the butterflies?
Yeah, I was just thinking about visually how the butterflies are usually displayed in like a display case, or how oftentimes they're pinned in such precision so that then they're maintained with their wings out.
Well, I just think it's interesting that you chose the butterfly as the insect when all insects are put in those boxes with the pins. So, and butterflies have this whole, metamorphosis and rebirth and something new. So it's kind of like you becoming something new. It's like the start of your process, really. But it's just kind of, I don't know if that was intentional. Like you could have chose, I don't know, a grasshopper or something to show on your slide. So I didn't know if you did that on purpose or that was just me looking too much into it or something. But anyway.
No, thank you for that interpretation. I think it was just something that I immediately thought of, trying to like search in my mind what is something that I can maybe draw inspiration from.
Sure. Hey, thanks for answering my questions. Hey, really good presentation too.
Isaac, I think Isaac has his hand raised there.
Yeah, so I mean, I just want to start off by saying that like your work is super awesome, and I like my professor told me that I would find this talk really inspiring, and I definitely did.
Oh,
But yeah, just awesome presentation. And I wanted to ask a little bit, or just talk a little bit about how, I mean, I love that last piece in particular, and the way that you talked about it being sort of a culmination of all the processes you've done and a lot of the like steps that you've gone through with your work. I thought it was like a really great way of putting it, because it definitely, like, without seeing kind of all the stuff you've made, or at the same time as seeing it, it really showed me like everything you've gone through in your artistic process. And I also love how I really love doing sculpture and installation work, and I love that you made a textile work that often in gallery spaces is shown as like flat on the wall, not to be touched sort of thing. I like how you made it interactive, because I think that textiles should be touched. It's just like the interaction that I've always had with textiles, and my mom is a textile artist. And I don't know, I just think it adds to the experience when you can like interact with something like that. Yeah, I don't even know if I had a question. I just wanted to say that like very enthusiastic about all your work. It's very awesome. But yeah, I'll have to check out all your other stuff.
oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I hope you get an opportunity to take that digital weaving course. I felt like that blew my mind and changed kind of everything that I thought about in terms of my practice.
Oh yeah, I'm very excited about that now. I was already thinking about it, but yeah, you've solidified my decision to take that class. So thank you.
Any other questions? Comments? Do you have any shows planned soon? I'm super excited to follow you on Instagram or whatever. Yeah.
Um, as, as of this moment, I have a print in uh, in Texas, but typically I feel like my prints do better in exhibitions for some reason at this time. So I currently don't have any of my weavings being exhibited.
Could you comment a little bit about that? What do you mean they do better? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I just feel like sometimes I feel like there's maybe more calls for prints as well, or even sometimes when I'm applying a few different pieces that are all various disciplines, I feel like I don't know if people are gravitating towards the prints themselves based on the images, but I feel like that's what I am often shipping off to be exhibited.
Yes, I want to, what is the word? Not challenge you, but I want to encourage you to answer calls using your textiles. For example, I just had work accepted into a photography show, with text, with digital weaving. And I think there's a lot of openness to like looking at non-disciplinary approaches to, other. So I know what you mean, but I don't know that it's necessarily has to be that way, right?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Well, Toon, thank you so much for being with us this evening. It's been so great having you. Just thank you. Obviously you have inspired like so many people with all of the comments that are coming into the chat. So much love. You all can check out more work. I did put your website in the chat. And just for everybody also, this conversation will go on our archive next week. You can check that out at our website here. That's what we have for you all this evening. I know, Shelley, y'all are going back into class, so we'll let you get back to it. But Toon, thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, have a good night, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you so much.
everybody.